Some people say eat a bunch of carbohydrates with breakfast so you can burn them off throughout the course of the day. That makes a lot of sense. Some people say I like my carbohydrates at night. I fall into that category. I like having my carbohydrates at night because I feel like I get more of a benefit that way. You see, I don't always eat carbohydrates. Those of you that know me know that I typically follow a relatively low carb lifestyle, but you also know that I don't do keto or low carb all year round. I have periods of time in which I have carbohydrates. But when I do have carbohydrates, I stack them into two very specific time periods. I have them surrounding my workout, typically post-workout, sometimes pre, depending on what exactly I'm doing. Okay, but that is a relatively small amount, and we're gonna leave that off the table because that's really like maybe 30, 40 grams of carbs tops. But most of my carbohydrates I allocate to the evening time. Now the interesting thing is, for me, and I know a lot of people feel like this, if I eat carbs throughout the course of the day, I don't feel great. I feel like I'm hungry a lot. I feel like I ride a blood sugar roller coaster throughout the course of the day. That's not saying that it's bad to do so. Plenty of people have built amazing physiques. Plenty of people are successful and are amazing human performance people. They just are great with carbs throughout the course of the day. But I don't feel that great with it. And as someone that has suffered with sleep issues for a long period of time, I find that allocating my carbs to the evening gives me the best of both worlds. I get the carbohydrates, I get the glycogen replenishment, the carbohydrates that store in my muscles, but I also get the improvements in sleep. And there's good evidence to back up how it helps sleep. So let's dive into that. There was a study that was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Okay, and it took a look at a high glycemic meal versus a low glycemic meal 4 hours before bedtime. And what they did is they gave subjects a kind of a random number, 767 calories. Okay, now most of this was carbohydrates. 90.4% of it was carbohydrates. Okay, then 8% was protein and a little over 1% was fat. They divided these into two groups. One group was high glycemic rice, so jasmine rice, that was like 109 GI, so high glycemic, big insulin spike. Another one was Mahatma rice, which is a lower glycemic rice, more like 50 on the GI scale. They also wanted to measure time frame, so they took a look at eating this 4 hours before bed or 1 hour before bed. Results were really interesting. They found that when they looked at sleep onset latency, how long it takes to fall asleep, the high glycemic group had about a 9-minute sleep onset latency. They fell asleep in about 9 minutes, whereas the low glycemic group fell asleep in about 17.5 minutes. That's a huge difference. The other interesting piece was that the group that ate 4 hours before bedtime fell asleep in 9 minutes. That same kind of meal 1 hour before bedtime, it took them 14.5 minutes to fall asleep. So eating more of your carbohydrates a little bit earlier in your dinner window is probably better. You don't want to be stacking a bunch of calories late in the evening, which is interesting because that's probably the biggest hurdle that people are going to face. Why would I want to have a bunch of carbohydrates right before I'm sedentary? That's a recipe for fat accumulation. And you're not exactly wrong in some ways, but you're having them early enough by having them 4 hours, 3 hours before bedtime, where you're going to have your blood sugar levels stabilize before you're going to bed. So you're not going to bed with astronomically high levels of blood glucose. The reason that you're getting a benefit when it comes to sleep with this is because by having higher levels of circulating plasma insulin at this point in time, you are allowing more tryptophan to get into the brain. Okay, here's sort of the biochemistry of what's going on here. Tryptophan is an amino acid that goes into the brain and it converts into serotonin and converts into melatonin, which helps us sleep. Now, generally speaking, especially if you're eating a lot of protein and you're working out a lot, that tryptophan has to compete with a lot of other amino acids. So what happens is you have a low tryptophan to amino acid ratio. When you have carbohydrates, that spikes insulin. When you have that insulin spike, those other large neutral amino acids that tryptophan competes with, they go to the muscle because the insulin lets them in the muscle. So all of a sudden, all the competition that the tryptophan had is now shuttled into the muscle, leaving a higher tryptophan to large neutral amino acid ratio. So now you have more tryptophan that can get into the brain, convert into serotonin, convert into melatonin, and help you sleep. It doesn't mean that you just go eat a bunch of carbohydrates. It doesn't mean that you do this every day, but rather than having this like surge of carbohydrates throughout the day, if this is something that bothers you, just stack 40, 50, 60, 80, even 100 grams of carbohydrates towards the evening time and see what it does to your sleep. I did put a link down below for today's sponsor, which is Thrive Market. If you're trying to find like cleaner carbohydrate options, which can be a little bit difficult, I think that is a great place to start because you can sort by diet category. So what I'd recommend you do is use that link down below and sort by the paleo category. That way you're getting relatively like more close to the earth types of carbohydrates. They might be a little bit lower glycemic, which goes against this study that I talked about, but I promise you I'm not sitting there eating high glycemic rice. I'm usually eating sweet potatoes, maybe some red potatoes, maybe some regular russet potatoes, things like that are decently lower glycemic. So Thrive Market is an online membership-based grocery store. So all the products there, or almost all of them I should say, have Thomas DeLauer's stamp of approval on them. So they're foods that I would eat, whether it's keto, whether it's fasting, whether it's vegan, it doesn't really matter. They're things that I would approve. And then it's online grocery store, so it gets delivered to your doorstep in a couple of days. Super convenient. And the cool thing is that link down below will save you 25% off your initial order. So 25% off your first order plus a free gift if you use that link down below. So big thank you to Thrive Market for getting better carbohydrate options that work for me. So that link is down below if you want to check them out. So the timing is obviously important because we don't want our glucose spiking super high, but also tryptophan levels are going to peak. That tryptophan to the large neutral amino acid level is going to peak between 2 and 4 hours. So for the maximum amount of sleep, that's what you're looking at. Now, protein comes into the equation too, okay? On one hand, protein is going to slow down the digestion of the carbohydrates, which could negatively affect the sleep benefit. But that's not the end of the deal. We can look a little further. Protein, although it might slow the digestion of the carbs, it's also going to increase the levels of tryptophan in the bloodstream, which could offset it a little bit. There was a study that was published in the journal Clinical Nutrition that found that protein ended up attenuating the postprandial glucose excursion by 71%. That means that that huge glucose spike that you might get after a high glycemic meal, well, it doesn't necessarily negatively affect insulin a whole lot, but it can affect the glucose spike. You see, protein is insulinogenic itself. So it's kind of interesting, like, for example, as an aside, you look at whey protein. Whey protein spikes your insulin quite a bit, and it can actually drop your glucose, okay? What we're looking for is not a glucose spike. We're looking for an insulin spike, and the protein can give us an insulin spike in tandem with the carbohydrates that we consume. So we're not trying to just eat a bunch of sugar to get our blood sugar high. We're actually trying to keep our blood sugar controlled. So in that case, having protein with the carbohydrates could work to your advantage. Plus, if you're an athlete or you're working out or you're trying to lose weight, protein is always a good thing to be as like a staple. You want that as your foundation, if you ask me. Now, additionally, there was a study that was published in the journal BMC Medical Genomics, one of my favorite studies. It took a look at circadian clock genes. It took a look at various genes that were associated with not only the circadian rhythms, but also with how food is metabolized at different times of the day. And they found that in the morning, we have more insulin-resistant fat cells, which means that is a decent time to be consuming fat, okay? So I usually like to consolidate most of my calories and my fat into the morning, and a little bit more moderate fat in the afternoon, and then lower fat, higher carbohydrate in the evening, okay? Because I have less capability, I guess, theoretically, of storing fat in the morning if I eat more fat in the morning, okay? But I also like getting my caloric density there in the morning. So there's this old saying, eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, dinner like a pauper. What that simply means is larger meal in the morning, smaller meal at lunch, and an even smaller meal overall at dinner. You might be thinking, okay, well, I'm gonna have a bunch of carbohydrates. That doesn't sound like a small meal. That's where things get confusing because by volume, it might seem like more food. Carbs contain 4 calories per gram. Fat contains 9. So even though the volume of food looks so much more, it's probably less calories. So overall, as far as caloric load goes, you're better off having your carbohydrates in the evening time. It'll help you sleep. It'll give it time to get converted into glycogen so you have it for energy the next day. And it's making it so that you're not having to have them earlier in the day, causing that blood sugar rise and fall. So stay keto throughout the course of the day, have carbs at night, and you might even be surprised. You might even wake up in the morning and have higher levels of ketones if you're in ketosis and doing this and periodically playing with carbs. You'd be surprised how efficient your body can get at utilizing a relatively moderate amount of carbohydrates if you're insulin sensitive. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. One more thing for you to try. I'll see you tomorrow.